Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now, Robby Soave of Reason magazine. He serves as an associate editor and has a story in a recent edition of the magazine, Why Are Cops Putting Kids in Cuffs? Good morning to you.
Thank you for having me.
You talk about the role of a school resource officer. Could you talk to our viewers and explain what that is and how they ended up in schools in the first place?
Sure. So most viewers would probably be surprised to know that in the 1970s, for instance, there were no police officers in schools. It was totally unheard of. Now you have something like 40% of public schools have a school resource officer stationed in them, a cop who's charged with keeping the school safe, promoting general safety. The issue is when you have a student get in trouble for doing something wrong, it's often the school police officer who ends up handling it rather than the principal or the teacher or the counselor. The issue with this is you end up escalating kind of common disputes between kids that should be resolved by someone gets detention, someone claps erasers for a week. Now it's actually a criminal justice matter because the school police officer is taking care of it, and kids are ending up charged with, felonies and minor crimes for things that, when you were a kid, it would have been nonsense to think that you'd be arrested for doing that.
To make that point, you start the story talking about one kid and a carton of milk. Can you explain?
Yeah, this was a kid in a elementary school in Virginia, and he was actually entitled to a free milk carton. He gets the publicly subsidized lunch program, and he swiped his milk carton, and the school resource officer who was watching it thought that he was stealing it, and they got into an altercation, and that this kid is actually being charged with stealing a 40-cent carton of milk because it was a school police officer who handled the matter. And the state of Virginia is actually prosecuting it because his parents have refused to say that he did anything wrong, because it's nonsense for this to be handled in a court.
To your point then, that should have maybe been handled by school administration rather than a police officer who's there to serve other duties. That's what you're trying to say.
Right. What I'm trying to say is, and it's because of federal incentives, state laws, all these actual programs that the government sponsors to put cops in schools, that has given the schools almost virtually no chance to have their own disciplinary schemes run counter to the criminal justice system. They have every incentive to let cops handle it instead, and this is an enormous problem for disciplining our students in a rational, logical manner.
More about this story as we go on through the morning with our guest Robby Soave of Reason magazine. 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, Independents 202-748-8002. I guess the question is, how do we get here? How do we get where a school resource officer assigned to do one specific task, especially for school safety, handles these kind of myriad of disciplinary issues?
Yeah, so there are actually specific subsidies that the government provides to schools. It's called the COPS program, the CHP program, that have given hundreds of millions of dollars over the last several decades to schools. So it's incentivizing them to do it this way. The schools also, they face liability issues. They're like, well, if we have a police officer in the school, why wouldn't I let the police officer handle these issues? I don't want to get sued by anyone involved. I can just say, well, if the criminal justice system is going to handle it, then we're not going to get in trouble. It's sort of a default to, let's just go to the maximum. Let's, not worry about kids' due process rights, their constitutional rights. Let's just make sure we have this sort of over-the-top safe environment that doesn't really comport with reality, because schools are actually very safe. Is what a lot of people don't realize. People think, that school shootings are very common, school violence is very common. Those things happen and they're horrifying, but actually schools are statistically way safer than other environments. Your child is in more danger driving to school than they are when they actually get to the school, by several factors, several magnitudes of order.
To turn to the perspective of a school resource officer, what's it like for them to be pushed or at least put into these roles that go outside their initial purview?
So a lot of cops, some do enjoy doing this, but I've talked to sheriffs, I've talked to higher-ranking police officers who think this is not the best use of police officers' time to handling if two kids get into a fight on the playground, bringing one of them down for questioning, fingerprinting them at the station, having them in the jail overnight.
And it goes that far.
It goes that far. I've seen kids I saw a kid who kissed a girl on a dare, and he ended up charged with sexual assault. He was a 13-year-old. I mean, how nuts is that to be? We're not letting our kids fail anymore. You screwed up when you were a kid. You did things you regret. The purpose of school is to socialize young people in some sense. It's to teach them to reform their behavior, learn the boundaries, that you don't shove other people, you're learning that in school, just as you're learning math and reading and those things. But we're not teaching that if we're ruining kids' lives the first time they do something wrong. And kids who are arrested or have some encounter with the police when they're young have astronomically lower likelihood of graduating high school, graduating college, becoming productive members of society. There's no better way to make a kid a criminal than to expose them to the criminal justice system over something very silly when they're young.
What's been the response of parents groups, civil rights groups to these instances where kids are actually getting arrested for these kind of offenses that you described?
Well, most of these groups understand that these sorts of issues where students are being arrested disproportionately impact students of color, gay and lesbian students, underprivileged students for other reasons. That makes sense. These people suffer harms in all sorts of other kind of categories of policing, and it's true in school as well. So there's a lot of due process concerns here too, because most people know that, and most people don't know this, but police know this. They tell their own kids this. Lawyers tell you this. If you're questioned by the police, you say, I would love to answer your question, but I have to talk to a lawyer first. You don't answer police questions until you've consulted a lawyer. But this is very confusing now if we have a police officer in the school. The kids, obviously, they're 12. They don't know to consult a lawyer before they answer questions. They think he's like any other school official. We wouldn't want kids to ask for their lawyer when they were talking to the principal whether you kicked Johnny in the hallway. That's insane. But that is actually what they should do if they're being questioned by a police officer. I've seen cases where kids were texting things inappropriately to each other that they shouldn't have been doing. And it got seized by the school resource officer, and the kids agreed. They didn't know to say, you need a warrant to get my phone. They didn't know to say that. Obviously, they're kids.
So they hand over the phone. They
hand over the phone. There were inappropriate pictures that they shouldn't have had. Bad, whatever. They should have gotten in trouble. But they ended up charged with like child pornography, essentially trafficking. And again, these are 15-year-olds with pictures of other 15-year-olds. It's wrong, and their parents should be mad at them, but they should not go to jail for this. And they were facing sexual exploitation charges because they gave over their phone to a school administrator.
The story is, why are cops putting kids in cuffs? Our guest writing this story, here to take your question. Steve from Phoenix, Arizona, Democrats line. You're up first for our guest. Good morning. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN. My opinion is that I'm a truck driver, and with the police, you just disagree with them. It puts them in a bad mood. And boy, once that happens, it's on. So I would warn anybody, just keep your mouth shut around the police, because anything you say will piss them off. And next thing you know, you're in a handcuff.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, when you talk to a lawyer, when you talk to police officers tell their own kids, if the police try to talk to you, if they want to ask you questions, unless you're the victim of a crime right now and you need police help, you tell the police officer very politely, I would love to answer your questions, I would love to comply and help you, but I need to consult a lawyer first. That's what you say to police officers. This is, anyone involved in the criminal justice system knows that this is what you do. But of course, kids aren't going to know this when they're dealing with the police officers in their own schools. It's ludicrous to expect them to understand that this police officer isn't there necessarily to help you. The police officer, you could get in huge trouble. So that's another big problem with having the cops in the schools.
Boston, Massachusetts, independent line. Mark.
Hi, yes, thank you for taking my call, and thank you, guests, for bringing this topic up, because I think it is an important one, which is kind of a symptom of our overall kind of society, where it's breaking down to triggering safe spaces and intolerance in general to anything that does not, is not accepted by the overarching mainstream. If it deviates from that in the slightest way, there's a very militant kind of perspective nowadays, and it gets trickled into disciplinary things that there's no common sense anymore. It's just a very black and white, intolerant viewpoint, which is, I think, mostly kind of growing out of this leftist kind of, it's interesting, because it used to be the counterculture, and the left was considered, liberal and all that. I see that changing very, very. It seems to be getting a little fascistic, and it's interesting, because I've always considered myself a liberal, and I don't see that as being very historical liberal as far as I can see. As far as some of these policies, they seem to be going the opposite direction in a kind of authoritarian, fascistic way, just in my opinion.
I think that's right, and I worry about what kind of people we are raising in this environment of kind of over-the-top safety, and if anyone says anything offensive or does something offensive, we're going to, sternly punish them. We're going to involve the police officers. We're teaching kids that the purpose of school is to make you feel so safe beyond any actual reason, beyond any connection to physical safety, but to make you feel emotionally safe as well. And if we're putting kids through, 12 years of public schooling where this is the reality for them, what kind are we socializing a generation of people who believe powerfully in our Bill of Rights, in the rights that a modern free society affords its citizens? Are these kids learning about the importance of the First Amendment, of the right to have a lawyer before you're questioned by the police, of the right to due process? If they're being educated in these environments that are kind of unfriendly to those rights. So that's my concern, that when these kids go off to college and then they kind of crave the same emotional, in some sense, coddling they've become accustomed to in the K-12 system.
From Ladysmith, Virginia, Janice on our Republican line, on with our guest from Reason Magazine, Robby Soave. Go ahead.
Robby, 30, 40 years ago, my husband was a state trooper in Maryland, left the state police to go back to college, and worked as a resource officer in the Baltimore City school system. Absolutely, you ought to go and work with a resource officer today for just 1 month. I can tell you this, my husband's partner was black. He was referred to in those days as an Oreo. He got knocked around and pushed around. It was absolutely outrageous. Mondawmin Mall had to be closed down, Robby, because of the number of schools built around it, and these kids would get out of school and just come in wave after wave. That shoppers did not feel safe in the school, in the mall. Go work for a month with a resource officer. You're asking your cops to do what your parents won't do, what your churches won't do. You've just let these kids be raised by the village, and now you're stuck with them.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll let our guest respond.
Yeah, so that's interesting, though, because, and you said that he was a school resource officer some time ago. Actually, it's counterintuitive to most people, but crime in schools, violent crime in general, has fallen dramatically since about 1992, over the last 2 decades. 2 decades plus. These all measures of kind of violence and assault have fallen between like 40 and 50% over this time period. So actually schools today, there's almost less reason, and the headlines don't make sense because, if it leads, it bleeds, and we see what we read in the news and we think everything is getting worse and everything is so dangerous and we have all these problems. And we do have problems, and some schools do have some violence and lack of safety, and there might be reason to have police officers in certain schools. And I'm sure those police officers are doing a great job. But it's just not the case that it's kind of a wasteland of violence the way you might have said it was in the 80s when crime was like double what it is now.
Well, here's a viewer off of Twitter says that kids are bringing guns and selling drugs to school. You only get one fatal mistake. Yeah,
I mean, this attitude is, obviously that happens and that's terrible. And, we're so concerned about mass shootings in particular. Columbine is the driver of so many of these bad policies by itself, because it was a horrible thing. Obviously, you do anything you could to prevent this kind of thing, but it's hard to prevent what is very rare. I don't think these policies that it's not even guns anymore. Now it's look-alike weapons. Students are expelled for having look-alike weapons. Well, what's a look-alike weapon? I've seen cases where a fishing gear was considered a look-alike weapon because you had a knife to cut your fishing line, and he had it in the trunk of his car in the parking lot because he was going fishing after school, and they searched his car for nonsense reasons, and yet this kid was expelled for that. I mean, how silly is that? Aren't we? We're overstating the dangers, and we're overcompensating to such a degree that we're hurting students' rights, we're hurting their futures. I mean, there's the kid who chewed his Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. You've probably heard about that one. Mm-hmm. But stuff like that happens all the time. Kids expelled for nonsense. It's not even about the weapons themselves anymore.
From Vermont, Democrats line. This is Margaret for our guest. Margaret, thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm a retired teacher, and my first concern about this broadcast is that you come across, and I'm sorry I'm forgetting your name, but you come across as someone who's much more interested in a splashy story that's going to make a name for you rather than someone who really is interested in understanding a problem that exists and continues to exist and really report on it and research it and try to come up with some real information that would be useful and helpful to people. The basic history of this, which you started out with but really didn't explain very well, one of the basic components of the history of it is that educators felt, why should we be, is it a good use of our time to be acting as police officers? And that's really was the impetus for starting these programs. And that you at one point started out, well, the police feel maybe it's not a good use of their time. Is it a good use of educators' time to be having to act as police officers? That's really the problem behind all of this. And as a person stated before me at one point, it also has to do with the behavioral problems that schools are facing that they never faced before. And you talk about how...
Okay, Margaret, I'm going to leave it there only because you put out a couple of things for our guests to respond to. So
yeah, I don't think it's the case that behavioral issues have gotten worse. It's just this data doesn't match that. Students are better behaved and less violent and less dangerous today than they were 30 years ago. I really think that is just a fact. And you say, is it the teachers? Should it be teachers and school officials' jobs to deal with crime? No, absolutely not. If there's serious serious violence, crimes happening, absolutely they should call the police officers and have them deal with that. But what we're having police officers do now, because often they're in the school, is having them intervene in behavioral issues that are obviously not and should not be considered criminal in nature. And we're making the police officers respond to that. We're distracting from their other duties, and I think that's a problem. I do think the purpose of school is, in some sense, it's teachers' job not just to teach reading and math, but to teach young people the proper way to interact with each other, how civilized, dignified human beings act. I do think that is the purpose of school in some sense. And actually, it's interesting because colleges now are being asked to deal with a lot of things that actually are crimes on their own. The whole kind of sexual assault problem on campus and harassment problem on campus. The government has told schools that they have to deal with this internally. I actually don't like that approach because I think these are serious crimes that the police should be handling. But there's an example where the government is saying, yeah, it's the school's job to handle these things. So in a way, the K-12 system is getting off easy so far.
Is there any evidence by having these school resource officers, if they're doing these extra things, that there's a reduction of these type of incidents happening?
I mean, no, there's an increase, right? What are we talking? I mean, there's going to be more people being arrested, right? That's what intervening the police in this system. I mean, there's no evidence that I can see that putting lots more cops in schools is a driver in the reduction of crime or bad things happening in schools. And so but there's an increase clearly in people being arrested, people being expelled, young people, often disadvantaged people who need to get through school without an interaction with the police in order to succeed in life. And that's being taken away from them.
If these kids are arrested and charged, do they eventually get sentenced at all, or do these charges eventually go away? Is there a way to know how many of these kind of things go from that stage to being sentenced?
So what almost always happens is there's some kind of plea deal is worked out. Rarely does the kid actually do, jail, serious prison time or anything. Although that can happen. Usually the authorities will say, okay, yeah, well, we don't think you should go to jail for this, obviously. This is kind of silly. But you broke the law, and so we're going to give you, a year of probation or something, or we're going to take away your phone, or we're going to restrict you. Some of these, the sexting with the phone cases that I referred to, the draconian punishments leveled on these kids by the authorities are just unbelievable. I've seen kids who've they're not allowed to use the internet for the next 3 years of their lives or something. I mean, there's no way you become a normal, functioning human being if you're 16 and you've had the internet taken away from you for the next 3 years. There's no better way to turn a young person into an actual criminal than to isolate them from all their friends, tell them they're a sex offender for sending an inappropriate picture while they were in school. I mean, this is just crazy to be.
But they did break the law.
This way. They technically broke the law, but the law, I mean, this is the law dealing with child pornography, that kind of stuff, was clearly never intended to apply to people who were themselves under 18. I mean, that's, silly.
St. Augustine, Florida, Independent Line, Andy, hi.
Hello.
Hi, go
I was
ahead.
calling to say, hey, can you hear me?
Go ahead, you're on.
Hey, Robby, good to have on with you. I think you make some good points. One about the emotional safety of students. Schools aren't meant for that. Schools are not meant to teach, they're there to educate. This expectation of police officers, it's cleaning up behavioral problems. It all stems from a lack of personal responsibility, all the way down from the parents to the teachers to the administrators. We need to get back to policing ourselves, behaving right in the home first, not expecting the almighty government to come in and swoop in and teach us how to behave. Thank you very much. Y'all have a good day.
Yeah, related to that, I mean, we're also punishing kids for being interested in playing without being supervised. A related problem to this is this whole the Child Protective Services being called on every family and every parent who lets their kid play outside in the park by themselves. The laws now to punish parents who allow this behavior, to protect kids who are, you're not allowed to walk to school on your own. You're not allowed to walk home on your own. There are so many cases of the government swooping in and punishing families who thought, hey, you know what, my 9-year-old is a self-starter. My 9-year-old knows his way around the subway. He's good to get home on his own. The government has taken that parenting decision out of the hands of parents and said, no, it's so dangerous. They're going to be abducted. They're going to be violently murdered if we leave kids alone for 5 seconds. Even though, when our parents were kids, they would play. They would disappear for probably days at a time playing in parks, and it was actually more dangerous then. Now it's, again, the crime has fallen so much, it's very safe, and we've criminalized, being a young person going out and having time on your own. And I think I worry about what kind of society, again, we're raising that has grown up in this oppressive environment where you're not allowed to play by yourself or the government's going to punish your parents for it.
Here is Amy, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, Republican line.
Well, I think that one of the main problems for our society is that there's no respect for authority. In other words, children need to be taught that if someone tells you who's an authority to stop or to listen or whatever, that children need to be taught to understand that. And it's not just children, it's young people and adults. When the police say stop, people need to stop. And it starts from the very top of our president leading in a way that is law and order, to down to, the academia leading that way, to parents leading that way, and, people supporting all that. The riots, the news, all puts us in a position where there's no authority and there's lawlessness. And, we need to support stopping that.
Okay, thanks, caller.
Yeah, so I agree with that. To some extent, obviously, respect for authority figures can be a good thing. I actually think perhaps we are undermining people's faith in authority and respect for authority when you have things like cops in schools, and if you're young and you get in trouble for something petty, like the kid who's being prosecuted by the state of Virginia for grabbing a 40-cent milk carton. There's no way this young person comes away from this life experience having more faith in authority or having more respect for authority. This person's interaction with a police officer was very negative, and he's going to carry that in his heart the rest of his life. So I'm not anti-cop. Police officers fulfill an important a role in society, but if we use them too heavily and aggressively, it undermines confidence in them, and that's bad for them. It's bad for a free society, an informed citizenry. So I want to use police power appropriately in order to breed the respect the profession should have.
One more call. Jean from Appleton, Wisconsin, Democrats line.
Yes, I'd like to go back to your instance of the 40-cent milk carton, because in the case of a child who is entitled to free lunch, how likely is it that that child would have access to a lawyer, or that his parents could afford a lawyer? So this just builds on itself, that if you have a police officer in the school, you also need to have a lawyer in the school, that these kids can say, I need this lawyer by my side. It just doesn't make sense.
Thanks, caller.
That's a great suggestion, actually. That has not occurred to me. I will mention that when I talk about this in the future. That's a great point.
Our guest story you can find in the March 2017 issue of Reason Magazine. Robby Soave joining us to talk about his experience with school resource officers in school. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.
For our last half hour.